I'm going to kick off the first session, and I'm going to invite Aline Broden and Lauren Moulds and Scott Renton, and we're going to have a bit of discussion around making the undiscoverable discoverable. Lauren joins us from the University of Virginia Law Library and is an archivist, but has a digital responsibility to his role. Aline is our cataloguing archivist at the University of Edinburgh, and Scott Renton works in the library digital development team for the University of Edinburgh, and has been involved in all manner of cataloguing systems and platforms that we use across the library and museums teams. So, welcome everybody. It's great to have a dedicated session on cataloguing and on metadata and the challenges that we face. And I thought we'd pick on Lauren first, really. So yeah, get ready, Lauren. Can I just say, if you've got questions, please put them in the chats, and then I can pick them up from there, and we can make sure that we can ask the right questions to the right people, or explore particular themes that you're interested in. So Lauren, I wanted to pick up on some of the things that we talked about over the past few days. You have described how you've taken the data that was output from the editor tool, and then you've pulled it into systems at UVA and then made it more discoverable. I was wondering about any challenges around that, because we're thinking about how do we use, for example, our cataloging system, Archive Space, and push things out to make them prettier, to make them more engaging, to package them up for researchers.
Well, let's make sure that I'm not claiming more success than we've actually made. I think actually, so because our two respective projects, the Edinburgh project and the Virginia project, started relatively at the same time, but for a substantial amount of time unaware of each other, we had a very slightly different, well, we had a different approach in which we were looking to very richly describe our documents to confirm that they were extremely valuable pieces of historical archival documents, right? So what we did is we created starting with Dublin Core, starting with the frameworks that already existed for describing session papers, we expanded well beyond that and trying to include agent records, geographic locations, subject themes, taxonomies that were not sort of standard, that we knew fit really, really well with both historical and our own intellectual framework for describing these papers. So that being said, the next phase, as we call it, was using full text indexing from the Luna, from the editor tool, as we would call it now. And then the next phase, once the editor tool comes into let's call it a mature release, and we know what the data looks like, and it has some sort of API, we want to be able to then take the data that editor takes and then integrate it in with our metadata. And that's sort of, we got excited about crosswalking metadata. So we haven't done that yet, but we have every expectation that is really the way to go. Because from what we're seeing, the tool the data that editor is creating maps very, very well to what we've already created. And I think a lot of it is because our groups were working together to create that metadata scheme collectively. And so really it's just a matter of taking one framework and mapping it onto another one. But we do think that the work that we used to do that was so painstaking is now very, very straightforward comparatively and much faster, and will map well to what we've done already.
We've started off on a good note, because it really, really, one of my favourite things about cataloguing and being an archivist is, and Scott will know this from past work we've done, is doing that metadata crosswalking and getting systems talking to each other from an archival perspective, and use of the standards in the most flexible way, but
Right.
also being able to do it in the technical way and bringing the languages together. So Scott, I wonder if you want to jump in here and talk about things that we've done in the past, but also the challenges around tricky content and trying to get these things to fit.
Yeah, well, we've got sort of all manner of things really. Our collections ed platform for collections viewing is expressed in Dublin Core, but it's pulling content from the various systems. We use Vernon CMS, which is a museum's collections management system, and this expresses its content in Spectrum VRA. We also have Archive Space, which expresses content in EAD and the ICIG standard, and we have our rare books, which we're pulling in as well, which is coming through from Mark. And what we're trying to do, I think, and what we have tried to do in the past in Collections Ed, is we use DSpace as the sort of underlying repository for that, with some a web framework on top of it. And what we have had to do is really sort of shoehorn all these different kinds of data into Dublin Core along the way, and you can imagine some of the challenges that we've had with that. It has made for very extended Dublin Core, which perhaps is it will work for certain needs, but we have to think beyond that and think how it works for everybody, because we know that if somebody comes along and wants to OAI harvest, or if that's a concept that you're all familiar with, coming along and grabbing our data from our repository, what we'll find is that if we've extended that data too far, it loses the commonality and it loses the interoperability in some ways. So all your data might be there, but it might be expressed in a way that's difficult to really understand. Well, I think probably one of the best projects, I think, where we've exercised a lot of crosswalking would be the MIMO project. Now, MIMO was an international aggregator of musical instruments museums, which our colleague Norman, who I'm sure you're very familiar with over the last few days, led from Edinburgh. I looked after Edinburgh's contribution to that, and what we were doing was, in order to get the content into its final home, we were starting off with Vernon. So it was expressed originally in Spectrum VRA. It then moved into Dublin Core when it went into DSpace. It then got crosswalked into Lido so that it could go to MIMO, and then after it had left MIMO to go to Europeana, it moved into the Europeana data model. So you can understand, some of the challenges of keeping everything consistent and meaningful when it's gone through effectively 5 levels on the way through. So yeah, lots of challenges. I think as far as the editor stuff is concerned, I'm almost having sort of worked on the Luna template, Luna being the digital asset management system that we use. I mean, that template started off in VRA, but it is, it's been molded and changed a little bit over the way. So I'm always grateful that there was so little metadata in the session papers that you couldn't really go too far wrong with it. It was quite obvious where the small amounts of data you had to put would end up, and there would be very little ambiguity at the end.
It's great that that's what's great about the session papers. They're formulaic, they're of a type, and so and the way things have been structured, it is very it's a formulaic documentation, so you can pull similar data through. And before I move on to the question I want to ask Aline about that, Kyle Roberts has asked, will you be able to automate what you talked about, Lauren, and will there have to be human checking?
It's a fantastic question, and I think one that we've theorized how that workflow will go. As you saw last night with the editor tool, or we've seen through the the workshop, that the editor tool itself is one that's based on human correction as what, so it's teaching the model to be better. I don't think that we're going to just implicitly trust the data that we get en masse, because our collection is something that we can manage, because it's, 10,000 pages, and we don't have to look at those. The cover sheet's the most important one at the first page. I think what we would likely do is, as we created the document shell with the digitized images and sent that over to Luna, and it went through whatever that post-processing was, what we would call editor, and then the data was ready for harvest back at UVA, we would probably just flag it as something that needed to be vetted one last time to verify, that this stuff was coming over correctly. I think one of the biggest questions we have about automation, and I don't know if we've even discussed this as on a wider collective project, is disambiguation of the entities and geographic locations. Because quite simply, there's a lot of people who share names, there's a lot of people who don't have completed names, there's ambiguous references to locations. So I know that there exist lots of projects that I'm thinking of SNAC in particular, and there's gazetteers and all that sort of stuff that could help us be more accurate. But one of the things that for our data is have always been at pains to avoid ambiguation in agents and records for geographic records. So that hasn't been discussed. We don't have a workflow, but it is definitely something that needs to be addressed. And I think will make this tool even more powerful. And it's not something that I think we can't do. We just haven't done it because, we just saw that it could do it within the last few months. So I guess to answer the automation question, no, I don't think it'll come unvetted en masse to our site. But I don't really suspect that that's too onerous of a task, because once the tool becomes really good, we can trust it I think, to some extent, and then just make sure the data is coming over looks good, and then we send it off. There'll just be a flag step there, and if we have to make changes, we'll have to figure out what the reciprocity between our end and editor will be. But all of it is, I think, pretty manageable.
Yeah, that you brought up something really important there, actually, about authorities and agents and geographic data. And I know we've done projects before. So the Carmichael Watson project, which we had on a platform and we had to kind of bring into archive space, did originally have that geolocation gazetteer approach, so that we could accurately, because the Gallic place names had changed over time, so we needed to pinpoint on a map where were they talking about. But it's not quite a straightforward thing, that idea of language and description. And so I was going to bring Aline in at this point, because as cataloging archivist for us, you've worked on a number of projects where you've had to think about these things. It's not always straightforward. So it's not like the session papers where there's a structure to the actual documentation, or even to the archive collection, and you've had to think about, well, who's involved, what is this in the first place? So that beautiful, messy archival stuff that's going on, it'd be interesting to think about how these tools could help with this, or actually demonstrate, which is what we've been talking about all along, which is you need the tools because they help make things better and faster, but you also need the human being. So Aline, do you want to comment on what your experience is?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I hope I'm not gonna get disconnected again. I had a little internet beep, so if I disappear, my internet has done that, but hopefully not. Yeah, absolutely, Rachel. So I'm a cataloging archivist, but I'm not able to go as deep as I would want, obviously, because as an archivist, your goal is to put things out there. So for us on archive space, for example, so it's published, but sometimes, obviously, I wouldn't have the time to delve very deep into a collection which has like hundreds of volumes with like hundreds of pages and everything. So I have to rely on a lot of external information, so older hand lists, and we know, they're really good, but sometimes they're a bit out of date, or and also like information from book-selling catalogs, so things like that. So having something that would allow us to actually have a look into the contents really of something would really help, I think, for us as archivists to know, really to have this close look into a collection without having to spend, you know, hours and days that we don't have, unfortunately. It would be great if we had, but so you could have a look at, I can see a lot of ways it could be helpful for us to catalog it. So for example, to know the important content, to see what words come back again and again, and to see, and Rachel, we were talking about that, to see what kind of language is used. So for us to be able to contextualize it. So to really put everything in context, because this is the job of the archivist. And I think this is something that tools like this can't do, or they can't do it. So, you know, this kind of tool can give you a perfect transcription word per word, but they're not being able to really understand it. Like they're gonna see a word, which at the time was, you know, okay, and was become really outdated, or so the job of the archivist, I think, is to contextualize it. So obviously that's why it's a tool, and it's not going to replace the archivist. And you also have to be aware that even if it's AI, it's not neutral. It's just gonna show you what's inside, but you have to actually do the work and help the user understand it.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you, Deborah from the Folger Shakespeare Library, for putting in the social networks and archival content context link, because that fits quite nicely with what we're talking about, and that Lauren had mentioned it. And that idea of context and language and description is really important. I mean, if you consider people who've written about algorithms and various things, and how things that are built are only as good as, you know, the bias that the people who build them have. And we know, we've seen in various things, Google has bias, and they're having to continually correct that. And a former colleague of ours has gone to work on another very well-known social media giants in terms of taxonomies, to try and correct theirs. You know, so our work as archivists is valued in a wider context. But also, you know, if we bring it back to this idea of language, sometimes I think that our catalogue structures and our standards can straitjacket us in terms of that language. And I know there's been much debate about, do standards actually perpetuate issues around description? But we've got an ethical responsibility to consider that, and to think about, how do we structure our descriptions, our data about collections. I wonder if you want to come in here, Lauren, because we've, you know, Aline and yourself and I had a bit of a chat about this the other day, didn't we? About how that responsibility of getting our collections data into a sense where it's understood, or it's not as biased as it has been before.
Yeah, and I don't want to claim that I know how to do it right. I just want to, you know, I think one of the things that is important to recognize, that when you approach organizing data about historical subjects, or when we have to impose a way of describing, the way we choose to describe someone or an historical period, we just have to be constantly mindful that we're inherently biased in doing that. And again, I'll say, I'm trying to be mindful of it. I'm always trying to do better. But again, we have to listen to the people who are experts, listen to the people who use these collections all the time, and to constantly make sure that we're doing as best we can. And I think the other thing that I wanted to say, and I think it's slightly off topic, but one of the things that excited me the most about the session papers was, it's a collection that has historically been very difficult to access, and one that's been used by a very privileged subset of academia, simply because the way it's organized, the way it's collected is arcane, and it's a civil court, so it's not really based on precedent as much as being have to read these individualized cases to know what's going on. But I would say that that we have two things that we can do that's really exciting. First of all, of course, as archivists would say, we have a responsibility for respect des fonds to preserve the original order, and how these files were submitted to the court, how they were collected by their respective owners. But on the other hand, and I think this is actually my point here, is the digital component of this. And I think Mike's point as well about how it's really important to think about, it's just cool that we can get stuff out en masse. But I'll say that the session papers have become a much more democratic and much more comprehensive window into the past because we've opened it up. And we have to understand that the tools we've created, yes, are going to impose some problems, but we can correct them. What's so exciting about the session papers is they tell entire histories that have been locked up in archives about individual people, about individuals' lives and how they negotiated their time and each other. So I think that's what's so cool about the digital technology as well, is we're mindful of doing it as best we can, about our biases, about imposing descriptions on these things. It also makes them available to people that doesn't have us as an intermediary.
That really excites me as well. It makes me think of the, as activist archivists. So it's using these tools to, as you said, quite rightly, preserve, as we should, preserve original orders, provenance, and context, but then blow it wide open in a sense to allow more democratic access to explain that context and not get rid of it, but explain it and allow people to see what they want to be able to get out of these collections. I know that Aline is very aware of discussions we've been having in the archives team at the University of Edinburgh about how we use language and how we do that thing. But I was wondering, Aline, if you can see the potential for particular collections you've tackled where you could use technologies like Transcribus or something to actually get into the nitty gritty and then make them more democratically available. Tough question.
I'm trying to find a good example in our archives.
I was wondering about some of that we haven't tackled, like we've got the papers of Legum, who is a journalist in South Africa, and actually if we were to use some of these tools on the printed and the written in that collection, then it would be throwing out that much more detail that would allow people's voices to be heard, that when if we were just saying newspaper cutting 1953, Legum's notes on this 1954.
Yes, so Legum is a good example because we've got, I think that's 800 boxes that we got like several years ago. But with collection of this size, it's obviously really hard to find the resources. It's hard to find the resources. It's harder. So myself and my colleague Lorraine, the appraisal archivist, we actually decided to start a collection review and just went box by box looking into them, and then we realized how rich it was, and a lot of it was newspaper cuttings from African countries, so post-colonial, in the post-colonial era, and during this this transition. So it was actually really, really rich. So I think you're right, Rachel, that this is a kind of collection where you could have just like an idea of the richness it contains, but it's also the kind of collection where you absolutely need, an archivist and an expert, someone who is an expert in the subject to contextualize everything. Some of the material is really hard to see or hard to read, and obviously as an archivist you can't be an expert on everything. So you have to work with other people and then produce something which allows people to look into, a collection and see the richness of it. You don't want to close it because you're afraid that, it's going to be taken and not used in a good way. But you also, you also want to really make sure it's contextualized. I use this word a lot, but I feel like it's the key.
It's good.
I feel like that's what all these tools, which are really good, can't do. So that I think that's when the human actually have to intervene. And I also think no archival description is neutral, and I'm sure Rachel. So no human is neutral. Like no archivist can produce a neutral description. But I don't even think tools like editor tools like AI are neutral either, because they're created by humans. So you need to have this kind of awareness of who you are and the context in which you operate and what your tools are. And with all this knowledge, you produce something. Obviously, you won't produce something perfectly neutral or perfectly like enlightened, an enlightened description. But yeah, all you can do is be aware and do your best and have done your research.
Absolutely, and your point brings me back towards Scott and being a human being that creates systems and does that development work. And I'm sure you're not as flawed as some of us, but you will have your biases. Now, I was wondering, when you do your work, what you have to think of, and we're aware of, for example, platforms being built in a bespoke way, and I'm sure everyone's had experience of that, and then them either falling over or becoming old and obsolete, because not just because the technical language, but also how the technical stuff represents it as well. So I was wondering what your view is on that kind of bias and how that plays into development work.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if intrinsically pushing bias in as such, but it makes me think of our early experiments with crowdsourcing and that sort of thing. We set up a metadata games platform which was intended to sort of improve the searchability of the data that we have in Luna. And we found that we did drives where we got 30 or 40 people into a room at a time and just basically made them describe what was in an image. And I think what we found was we got an awful lot out of that in terms of data, but we didn't know how much of it was necessarily usable. I mean, we tried to do certain things around thresholds of agreement and corroboration and that sort of thing to push things in. But what we did find actually after a while was that it was almost the lack of automation that we had around the pushing the stuff back into the system that meant that we started to sort of fall behind and slip off there. I think that one of the things that we had to make sure about though was that we did impose a sort of two-tier thing to the metadata that came through, so that we made it obvious that anything that had come from one of these drives was given to us by humans and not or by lay people who were not collection specialists, and while it may help to find things easier in the system, it didn't necessarily improve the veracity of the data, and we had to be quite clear about that. And I know that this is a problem that comes up when you crowdsource in any context.
Absolutely. I know we did some work on sort of different forms of trying to crowdsource, particularly around language a number of years ago, and it gets you to a certain point. I think crowdsourcing works when there's a formulaic, but the kind of knotty, difficult archival collections of variety of formats and scripts and languages, and that that doesn't necessarily lend itself to crowdsourcing. It doesn't also at times, but it doesn't also lend itself to tools like Transcribus, because you can't build a model on them. So I'm wondering, let's take this conversation that step forward and think about the technology and the people coming together. Where do we go next on that those difficult collections that aren't formulaic, that aren't tidy, that are messy and reflect, you know, human beings often. It would be interesting to see what we can do to push forward these tools for cataloguing, for description, or for transcription, and how can we push them down that particular road, which it can't necessarily do at the moment. Lauren, do you want to comment on that? And can I ask everyone, do put questions in so I can ask our panel any questions you have on your thoughts on cataloguing and the things we've been discussing. Lauren, can you think of collections that you've dealt with which are knotty, not formulaic, not same material, that are a bit messy because they're from an human, for example?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that we have, at least from the law school's perspective, is I can think of two collections in particular. One, I mentioned, so we had 2 or 3 boxes that were just jam packed with negatives from the student newspaper, and from about the late 60s on through the 90s, all black and white for the most part. And we had a student digitize them, all of the negatives. There was 40,000 images. And, you know, this we probably accomplished maybe 6 years ago. And we tried to run it through, you know, some platforms that could do, you know, AI to sort of figure it out. And this was early on. It was Amazon technology. It was clearly had been developed in India, because all of the softball's a big thing at law schools in the US. And all of the softball came in as cricket. So, I mean, and then there was all sorts of issues that we had with using AI for it. And so then we said, well, we'll set up a system where we can have the people who have been at the law school for 30 years, employees, just when they have an opportunity, go through and do it. And it was valuable, but it was just so hard to get really reliable information, because they only want to do a few and they get bored with it. Or they do it differently than the person who did it before. And so then you have just this whole mess. It's not mess, isn't a fair, it's just that's how humans are going to do it. If you just send out over an iterative process of 10 different people doing it 10 different ways and picking the things that they're interested in. So that was one that's like, we haven't figured out the right way to do it yet, beyond simply just having one person hired to do it until it's completed. And then I think the other one that we had that, and maybe this doesn't answer your question, and I'll finish this really quickly. One of the things that we have a really large flagship collection about the war crimes in the Pacific, and we were donated because of the initial project that was online. We were donated by a family about 8 very dense binders of depositions based on these war crimes, and they were horribly graphic, and they were really, really, really difficult to get through, often quite bad. And so we have yet to figure out exactly how we want to take something that's so painful to read and actually quite traumatic to read just as archivists, but we understand that it is consequential historical information, but making it accessible. And obviously we weren't able to really get to it because we'd finally digitized it. We finally described it right about this time last year. So the pandemic has really thrown a wrench into how we want to move forward with that. But we do want to reach out to our colleagues at other institutions, particularly the National Holocaust Museum in DC, to say, how do we approach this material? And how do we present it online? How do we prevent people from being unexpectedly traumatized by seeing something that's just available on the internet? How do we contextualize that trauma? How do we make these available for the important documents they are? So those are the sort of things that I can think of, 2 collections that have imposed sort of problems to just sort of taking it and making it available.
That's you bring up a really good point, and it's, it is on point as well, because I can think of collections we've got that we've not dealt with at the University of Edinburgh. And we have talked within the archives team about resilience and the impact on the archivist as much as on the user when having to deal with those things. I think we could have a whole session on talking about the ethics, data protection and resilience as well. But thank you for bringing that up. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. First, I'm going to sort of ping this back to Aline. And would you say that the pandemic and requirement to work from home away from the collections has changed your approach to metadata creation?
I think we realize like there is a lot of things we can do from home, but also a lot of stuff we can't do from home. So I've been working with other member of the team to convert old hand lists, for example, into actual proper archive space resources. So to make it more searchable, etc. But we have to rely on them, and sometimes they've been created, 40 years ago or something. So there's still a lot of things you can do, but also you can't, just go to the collection and check something. You can. So I think you have to rely on machines, on all the finding aids. So it adds more layer between the original document and you. And I think this is more risky because the more layers between the cataloger and the document, and between the user and the document, the more risk for mistakes or misinterpretations there are. So working from home, I think, you can still do a lot, but you also have to be careful. And actually, the original documents are absolutely vital. And even when they've been digitized, sometimes they haven't been digitized entirely, or sometimes you want to check, a lot of things you can't actually see from a picture sometimes, like very faint writing, or, things that have been erased, or like the paper looks different, or things like that, I don't know. So, I think for me, it emphasizes the fact that original documents can't be replaced. You can't just, I don't think as an archivist, you can do the entirety of your work from home.
That's a brilliant answer to that one, I think. Thank you, Aline. And we're going to end, I'm conscious of time, we're going to finish with a final question from Elaine, which is on how can we be better at anticipating how our collections might be used by researchers, or how do we raise awareness of potential research activity? And do you think that will come as big data sets are opened up more and more? Can we anticipate how people use things from either a cataloging perspective or from a technical perspective? And I'm going to open it up to all three of you.
I would just like to mention that we've spent the last several years sort of getting our stuff online, and in a lot of cases for the first time. Things like our art collection and musical instruments collection, our archives weren't really available on the web until a few years ago, and that was sort of phase one. But phase two, I think, is sort of making that data things that people can actually work with and play with, and drill further into. And one of the projects that's been driven towards that is the Collections as Data project, which the Digital Library have been working on. It's been one of Mike's sidelines when he's not been doing editor, and we've started to make the university thesis collection available. I think there's about 25,000 theses there, and the Scottish Statistical Accounts, and a few other things to come. And I think it's really about getting the stuff out there and giving researchers the opportunity to start, investigating and doing things like text mining and data carpentry and digital scholarship and that sort of thing. I mean, it's new for us as well, I think, in a lot of ways, but it's definitely something that we are investigating a lot more and getting more knowledge about.
Yeah, it is. I think we'll be surprised as more and more opens up. But Lauren and Aline, do you want to respond to that?
I don't know if I have a good answer. What I'll say is I think it's a great question, and it's one that, in terms of Randy and Jim and I and our whole team at UVA, where we're trying to, we had discussed, the session papers were ones that we decided, how can we integrate this in with the larger academic world? Like that was the chief driving question, was how can we make these valuable? And what we did to do that was we surveyed faculty that we knew. We had subject experts who were actually on the team. We tried to go to conferences. We gauged people's interest. We saw what they were asking about, these sort of things, make it very, but that isn't really an approach that is universally available to archivists for every collection. So I don't know if I have the answer to that. I know that we found one collection that we knew deserved it, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other wonderful collections in ours and well, throughout the world that require work. I don't know if I have the right answer. I mean, the thing is just do the metadata right and do the description in a way that's honest and rich and anticipates. And I know she's in the question is how do we anticipate? I don't know. We just think, what would I do with this? I don't know. As an historian, I think I can say this is really cool and get super excited about something. So I didn't really give a good answer, but I think that's how today.
It was a very honest human answer. Aline, do you want to finally give a final couple of words?
Yeah, no, I think we can't, as archivists, anticipating all the ways researchers are going to use the collection, because I want to say it's researchers' job to actually find new ways, to find new ways to research something, to use a collection. So we can anticipate by talking, to researcher, to the community. We can base ourselves our own, experience. But yeah, I don't think we could anticipate everything, because there's always, someone that's going to surprise us. For example, people looking at, the genetic material of charters or something. So yeah, I would say this is almost like researchers' job, actually, to find new ways to look into things.
Well, that's a good final point and end to this session. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. And thank you to the panel. Thank you, Aline and Lauren and Scott, for being part of this. We're now going to have a 15-minute break, which you can go into the Slack channel and talk to your colleagues there. And then the next session will be started and hosted by Jim and Buski when we come back at just around 4 o'clock. Elise will put the countdown on the screen. So thank you very much to everybody for this session.